Okay, so we'll go into visual representation of data. Prior to going over this section, please make sure you're really comfortable with Gaston Ledford's chapters 5 and 6 for the previous weeks, going over how we collect data and different types of ways to collect data. Those are basically prerequisite skills in representing your data. So within this chapter, chapter 7, Gaston Ledford go over several different types of visual representation of data. We will focus mostly on line graphs and bar graphs. They do go over cumulative records as well as semi-logarithmic graphs as well. Those are less frequently used in practice, so we won't spend a lot of time on them. However, you should be familiar with them. Um, but line graphs and bar graphs we use regularly. Currently, a lot of agencies use electronic graphing that will graph for you. I think it's a really important skill for you guys to learn how to graph by hand. So I would play around with using Excel and graphing data that way, as well as literally by hand, just pen and paper graphing. When I first started in the field, that was the only way we had to graph. Now it's been made a lot easier with technology, which is great, but you still want those foundational skills in how to graph, and that will help you truly understand what you're graphing as well. Basically, why do we graph? We graph to organize our data and use formative evaluation. So a graph is a really easy way to see if your behavior is increasing, decreasing, to see if there's any different changes during in the independent variable. It's really, really an important and useful tool within the field of ABA in order to make evidence-based decisions on your interventions. Um, so in single case design and research, graphing is also an important tool. It will help you understand your research, but this is in practice really important to our field and what we do daily. So line graphs. The line graph is the most commonly used in the field of ABA. We take data daily, and this will allow you to continue using the same graph daily. We typically don't present more than 3 behaviors on a single graph. And they're just really easy to understand. They're visual, and you can see a clear increase or decrease in behavior. So Gaston Ledford gives several different examples. Below here is one example that shows all of the different areas of a graph. So if you look here, you will see the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis is always over time, so like number of days, number of sessions, and then the y-axis is how you graph your dependent variable. You can put in condition change lines, so that will be a vertical line in your graph, and that will signal any type of change to your independent variable. So that could be a change in medication, that could be maybe a different staff member was working with your client that day, it could be a modification to the intervention, anything that may have an effect on how your dependent variable presents would be there. And then you have data points, a data path that connects your points, and then trend lines. Trend lines are the overall path that your data is taking. So if you have a flat trend line, that means your behavior is stable. If you have a ascending trend line, your behavior is increasing, descending, behavior is decreasing, and so on. You can look at Gaston Ledford's different tables on line graphs and get a little bit more of an idea of how they're implemented and what types of behaviors. Typically, you'll have your baseline and then your intervention, as you can see on this example here as well. So then he also goes into bar graphs. So bar graphs are slightly different. It's used to display discrete data and also comparative information. There's numerous variations in bar graphs and how they're displayed. It's very different as opposed to continuous data like your line graph. So that can be graphed daily as your sessions go on. A bar graph is basically a summary. So overall, what the behaviors have seen. 2 basic bar graphs, a single bar in an experimental condition, and then several bar graphs. So here's an example from Gaston Ledford as well. So you can see that there are on the x-axis two different months that we're tracking those behaviors, so a pre-test and a post-test for the intervention, and then the mean percentage of those behaviors occurring. Bar graphs are, again, very easy to read, but display very different information as compared to a line graph. So Gaston Ledford goes into more examples of those bar graphs. I find them most useful for comparative data, whereas those line graphs I'm using pretty much daily for target acquisition and as well as behavior reduction. So your behavior intervention plans, you'll typically be tracking your data using a line graph. Again, the rest of the chapter focuses a little bit more on different types of graphs. We won't go into too much depth because they're not used in our everyday lives as behavior analysts, but really focus on the line graph, bar graph, and I really highly suggest playing around with Excel and practicing graphing using that. It's a really important skill, and it will help you understand those graphs as well and what they're representing.